Good morning. This is Richard Fazy with Energy Futures Group. We'll be going over the Vermont residential building energy standards, the updates to the code in Vermont that will be taking place in January of 2020. This presentation was provided to the Burlington Electric Department in Burlington on June 11th, and the same content will be recorded here. So I will be breaking this into two sections. The first section of this recording will include the welcome and introductions. We'll go over a little background and framework, scheduled process, opportunity for input, look at some code compliance issues, and then review the existing code requirements in summary. The second recording will include all the updates. There will obviously not be a discussion here at this point in time, but we'll wrap up with that second conversation. So to start, some introductions. As I said before, this is Richard Fazy, Energy Futures Group. We have been working with the Vermont Department of Public Service in updating the code for Vermont. That's being led by Kelly Launder, along with Keith Levinson and Barry Murphy. Energy Futures Group, in addition to myself, Richard Fazy, Gabrielle Stebbins, and Emily Bergen have been part of the team here. Our commercial partners on this have been Navigant Consulting, Keith Downs, Stu Sloat, and at CX Associates, Evelyn Killian and Jen Kyoto. We also have had national support and input from the New Buildings Institute. They've provided a roadmap, which I'll go over quickly, Jim Adelson and Jim Makala, Eric Makala, and then and Efficiency Vermont, last but certainly not least, provided extensive support throughout this process, Brian Just at Efficiency Vermont. Of course, we won't be going over who's in the room today, but at the previous trainings that we have held in June and in May, in Burlington and Montpelier, we have had a variety of participants and hopefully gotten the word out on Vermont's new code update process. In terms of a little background and framework, Vermont has had in effect a building energy code, both on the residential and the commercial side. The residential building energy standards went into effect in July of 1998. The legislation passed the previous year. This code, as I'll talk about in a little more detail, affects all new homes and additions and renovations built after that time. The enabling legislation as well, 30 VSA Section 51, calls for an update to the code to occur every 3 years or so. So RBES has been updated pretty regularly since it went into effect initially in 1997 and then updated in 2005, 2011. Right now we're under the 2015 version, and we're referring to this new version of the code as 2019. Hopefully it will be enacted in 2019 and go into effect in January 2020, which is the process we're under right now. In addition to the original enabling legislation, there are a number of other provisions in the code, in legislation and policy that pertain to Vermont's energy code. We've got some energy efficiency goals that the state is trying to achieve. We've got some greenhouse gas reduction goals as well. There's a renewable energy standard that incorporates some reference to solar, specifically net metering, as well Tier 3 as it's called. There's a statewide total energy plan, requires fossil fuel use reduction from utilities. And this is driving a shift to electricity, which you'll see referenced in this new version of the code quite a bit. Vermont also has put in place comprehensive energy plan. The first one is in 2011. It called for all new buildings needing to be designed to be net zero by 2030, and the 2015 subsequent version of that referenced that as well. There are additionally resolutions, agreements, and other initiatives underway moving towards strategic electrification, electric vehicles, limiting greenhouse gases and emissions that are all captured in the code as well. So I mentioned New Buildings Institute earlier. They helped us and played a key role in trying to address this question of how Vermont is going to achieve net zero new construction buildings, that's both on the residential and the commercial side, by 2030. They did some modeling for us based on work that they have done in other states around the country, and looked at what it would take for us to get to a point where our buildings are efficient enough so that if we just put renewables on the roof, the sort of typical roof area of our existing homes, they would achieve net zero. So in order to do that, they looked at the typical energy use per square foot, or EUI, energy use intensity of our buildings called out in our existing codes, and what we need to do each step of the way to get to a point where our buildings are efficient enough so the roof area would allow for PV to provide all of the energy needs for that house. Those homes would need to be somewhat less than use half as much energy as they do now. If we're now at about 49 BTUs per square foot, we would need to improve 10% or 15% or so, you'll see, better than where we are now to get to the 2020 version of the code. And then subsequent, we need to have 15-20% savings or so each year, that by 2029 or in anticipation of 2030, we would need to use about half as much energy as we do currently. So this is taken into account in the code update process, and it's been part of the driving force behind why we're ratcheting up the efficiency levels of the code in order for us to get there. So with that as background, talk a little bit about the schedule and process in terms of where we are now. So we've been engaged in this and tried to reach out to all the stakeholders pretty aggressively along the way of the development of the code. We began this process in mid-2018, and we started it off with some stakeholder meetings in Hartford, Vermont, White River Junction, and Burlington, try to see what the interest level was and what the issues were from people out there in terms of updating the code. We also formed an advisory committee and have met a number of times in Montpelier. In August of 2018 was the first one of those meetings. We had subsequent follow-up stakeholder meetings, had a webinar, conference call, met with affordable housing stakeholders as well to address their issues specifically around multifamily buildings, and then subsequent advisory committee meetings as well in October, and then we've had smaller discussions along the way as particular issues have come up. With all that, we pulled together the updates to the code and presented what's similar to what I'll be talking about today at the 2019 Better Buildings by Design Conference in February 2019, held a training May 1st in Montpelier, and then subsequently one in early June in Burlington. Along the way, we have tried to engage and have had representation from the whole list of entities you can see on the right: energy efficiency utilities, architects, builders, ASHRAE, which is our American Society of Heating and Refrigeration engineers, log home representatives, affordable housing, insulators, state officials, regional energy advocates, trade associations, and others as well too. So we really have tried to take the input and solicit feedback from all of the interested groups in updating the code. So with that input, we've been moving through the regulatory process, the rulemaking process that is required of any new rule, which RBES code falls underneath in Vermont. And so this is what it looks like here. We've had after the Montpelier training in early May, we submitted the proposed rule, the proposed updated RBES, to the internal Committee on Administrative Rules for the state. This is a process whereby they need to make sure that procedurally all of the steps are in the right order. So that that kicks off the formal rulemaking process with the Secretary of State. We then have put out there the RBES rule for public comments. Those are currently open, but not for much longer. Those close in early July. We did hold a public hearing at the State House on June 21st. Didn't get a lot of input, but did have some people come. We saw that as a good sign that that we've addressed people's concerns and have tried to incorporate those into the code. Comments will be are being solicited and are going to be taken into account and addressed in mid-July. And with those, we'll make final tweaks and edits to the language of the code and then submit those to the formal 90-day, 3-month LCAR process. So this is a Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. So this is a committee that meets every 2 weeks and reviews different rules that are being proposed in the state. We expect a meeting, a hearing from the LCAR committee, and by the end of September, and then hopefully they will adopt the rule in September. Subsequently, there are 3 months after the rule is adopted in order for the rule to be enacted and then go into effect. So we are anticipating at this point in time that by the end of December, the RBES would be enacted and the process for the adoption of the new code to begin in January 2020. However, there may be slips and delays along the way, so there's no knowing for sure exactly what the time frame is going to be until the final word comes out. Then subsequently next year, we also the department looks to begin a code collaborative process in which preparing for the next version of the code, addressing a number of issues that weren't able to fully be addressed in this version of the code will take place. So look for word on the code collaborative coming up after January of next year. I've mentioned this process here. This sort of summarizes the previous slide. We've been through the LCAR process for public review. There's a public hearing has taken place, written comments through July 10th. There's the website addresses here, and subsequently in other slides in the slide deck, the section of the Vermont Department of Public Service on Building Energy Code Standards update. Make sure to look for the update process there, so not to get mixed up with the ongoing code. And then we are anticipating proposing the rule through the LCAR Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules by the end of July, with an August hearing if everything works out there. In terms of code compliance, this is an important issue that has come up throughout all of the conversations and the discussions that we have had, both in the stakeholder advisory committee and in the trainings as well too. So just want to make the point that code compliance we acknowledge is critically important, and the best code in the world is not going to be not going to succeed at improving our building stock if it's not complied with. The Department of Public Service does do periodic baseline studies or market assessment studies looking at representative typical sample of new homes in Vermont to gauge compliance with the code. So they've completed 3 studies. There's a 4th study that was done a couple of years ago that the results are due out shortly. Subsequently, the compliance rate with the code, at least the technical compliance rate, that is the physical energy saving features in the building, how many of those homes would comply with the code at that point in time. That's basically the question that's asked. And in 2002, about 58% of new homes in Vermont met the compliance rate of the code. That went up in 2008 to 72%, and up slightly more in the 2011 study to about almost 3/4 of all homes are actually built to the code, given the fact that Vermont doesn't have a lot of code enforcement out there. The most recent version of the study is expected to have slightly lower compliance rates, but still in the 2/3 of homes range compliant. So We recognize that while code compliance is clearly an issue that needs to be resolved and it's ultimately important for the success of the code, it's specifically not addressed through the code update process. There is not a provision in the code update process that talks about responsibility of entities for actually enforcing the code. And so that we acknowledge is really needed in order to level the playing field for all builders. So there is some additional work that's being done to address this issue, but outside of this code update process. In 2012, acknowledging that compliance is ultimately important and also addressing a federal question about this issue, the Department of Public Service issued a Vermont Energy Code compliance plan, achieving 90% compliance by 2017, and that was 90% compliance to the 2009 IECC code. So out of that study, there were a number of recommendations and quite a bit of progress to date, including the fact that the municipalities would need to ensure that any town that has a certificate of occupancy needs to require a version of the code compliance RBES certificate be provided as part of the permitting process. And so Efficiency Vermont as well did quite a bit of work around supporting that effort. The Department of Public Service has the Division of Fire Safety at the Department of Public Safety has now been requiring a code certificate as part of issuing the state building codes whenever that's required. Typically that's for commercial and multifamily buildings. Act 250 as well requires compliance with the stretch code, which we'll talk about. And Efficiency Vermont has done quite a bit of work providing code trainings and support around RBES. We've seen an uptake in builders and lenders requiring code compliance and documentation of code as part of their closing process. So making sure that the RBES certificate is part of that mortgage closing process and also on the closing attorney's checklist. There's also a good bit of effort underway in terms of builder licensing and registration. At the state level, there's groups that are working on trying to level the playing field by making sure that the RBES code is complied with. So acknowledging that code compliance and enforcement are really the elephant in the room, and while we're talking about updating the code, what good is it without compliance? And compliance is necessitated by enforcement in many cases. So there was some work that's been done in the legislature this year, and S-163, which included a builder registry, was passed. The hope that as a step in the right direction, that if all builders need to register with the state, and this could be including as part of that subsequently requirements that the builders comply with the code. This was seen as an initial step in that direction and moving towards a broader enforcement effort. There's also been a builder collaborative that's been thinking about ways to promote code enforcement that's underway and having discussions with the legislature. And of course, this will be a key topic and addressed in the code collaborative that I mentioned earlier that will be taking place in 2020 of next year. This code collaborative, in addition to addressing compliance and enforcement, is also anticipated to talk about administration of the code. Right now, there is no designated entity that's responsible for providing interpretations of the code, ensuring that that it be complied with through the multiple areas where those requirements already exist. for instance, with municipalities and with Act 250, and just ongoing maintenance and issues in supporting the code. There's no definition of net zero design at this point in time. There are a lot of them that are floating around out there in other states and other organizations, but Vermont hasn't addressed that yet. Some issues that came up and at the Code Advisory Committee around looking at embodied carbon as part of the requirements of the code, but those issues haven't been addressed in this version of the code. So next time around, the Energy Code Collaborative, this would be a good topic to pick up. And then also looking at what the next version of the code looks like, what sort of standards and measures would be required in the next version of the code. So with that, I'm going to go over some review and overview of the of the existing RBES residential building energy standards and what's currently in the 2015 version of the code that one needs to comply with, and use that as a foundation and the basis for the new version of the code going forward. So RBES was enacted, as I mentioned before, in 1997, Act 20 of that year, and in that enabling legislation, it referenced a basis of the International Energy Conservation Code. At that point in time, it was called MEC, or the Model Energy Code. This is a performance-based system that allows some different provisions for meeting the code through a couple different ways, which I'll talk about. And then included in there too, there's some Vermont-specific additions, exemptions. A number of states take the Model Energy Code and just adopt it wholesale at a statewide level. Vermont decided that there are a number of pieces of it that didn't make exact sense for Vermont, but using it as a basis makes a lot of sense. So that was what Vermont has done at that point in time. And then it's updated regularly as well too on a national level. And so with each version of Vermont's code, we look at what the improvements and changes they made nationally and make subsequent Vermont tweaks to that national standard. In Vermont, because we don't have code officials except in a handful of municipalities, our code allows self-certification by builders. And then it calls for a 3-year revision cycle, which I talked about earlier. Through that, there's a public review process as well. And so we've gone through that and in our update process here. So which buildings must comply as specified under the Vermont code? New construction, low-rise residential. So this is defined as 1 and 2 family dwellings and multifamily buildings that are 3 stories or less. So this does not include commercial buildings, but does include the residential part of mixed-use buildings. And so what this basically says is that any multifamily building that is 3 stories or less falls under RBES. Any multifamily buildings that's 4 stories or higher needs to fall under the commercial building energy standards, or CBs. The code also covers existing low-rise residential buildings, and this would comply. This means that additions would need to comply, but only the addition needs to, not the existing building that isn't being touched in an existing home. But when in an existing home, if you're doing a renovation, window replacement, or equipment replacement, anything that you touch in that building would need to be brought up to code. So that is a commonly misunderstood and not complied with provision of the code, but by law, existing buildings, when you touch an energy-related component in them, need to comply with the code. So what is required under RBES? There's a set of basic requirements, which I'll walk through. And then there's a performance requirement. And there really are 3 ways to meet the performance requirement of RBES. There's a prescriptive method, and that's basically you must have RX in the ceiling, RY in the walls, windows of a U factor of a certain level or less. And there is a ResCheck software. So this is a nationally Department of Energy provided piece of software that is customized for Vermont. And if you choose to use this, you basically plug in the R values in the areas of your building, and it would need to meet the specific requirements for the RBES code in Vermont. So this is a performance method that would allow you, if you don't want to follow the prescriptive checklist, you could use the software that the Department of Public Service will be providing when the code rolls out. Or you could participate in Efficiency Vermont's new construction program and receive a home energy rating and comply that way as well. In addition to the basic requirements, a performance requirement, pick your method, there's also certification. So there's I've mentioned this a couple times, the RBES certificate, a one-page certificate that needs to be posted on the building. Typically that would be on the electrical panel or somewhere nearby. Needs to be filed with the town clerk, and also needs to be mailed in and provided to the Department of Public Service. There are some exemptions that are provided as part of the code. If you're building a building that uses extremely low energy, very little energy use, and this is defined as less than 1 watt per square foot at peak load. This is during the peak, measured at the peak day of the year. That would be exempt from the code. So a very efficient building would be this case. Mobile homes are covered under federal provision, and so there's a federal preemption and would not fall under the Vermont code, because presumably the feds have it covered, and states cannot supersede that federal standard. However, site constructed components like basements, crawl spaces, slabs, if this is sitting on a heated foundation, or any other additions to that mobile home or manufactured home must meet the RBES standards. Any buildings or areas of the buildings not heated or cooled are exempt. So if you've got an entryway or a storage shed or something like that doesn't have any heating or cooling, or the building itself is not heated or cooled, building a barn, those don't have to comply with the code. Vermont specifically also exempts hunting camps, summer camps that have biomass, that is a wood stove or on-site renewable heating, are exempt from the code. That is, as long as they remain that way. I'll talk about a little bit about what happens when they transition to a heated space in a minute. Yurts, the same with biomass or on-site renewable heating and hot water, are exempt as well too. So you see the summer camps, if you put an electric or a gas water heater in it, but you heat it with a wood stove, it's exempt. But a yurt would need to have all of those be on-site renewable in order to be exempt. And then historic buildings can apply for exemption. So this would be a historic building that's going through a renovation, and there's an exemption process under the Division of Historic Preservation specified in the code that you would need to go through to get that exemption. However, if a hunting camp or a summer camp is changed use from the way it is defined, then it would need to comply with the code. So the section R505 in the RBES specifically states that code compliance would come into effect if spaces there are undergoing a change that would result in an increase in demand for either fossil fuel or electrical energy. So any space that's converted to a dwelling unit or a portion thereof from another use would need to comply with the code. This specifically addresses summer camps or hunting camps that install an automatic heating system or convert from an unconditioned space to a conditioned space as defined in the code would need to comply. So if they're built as a summer camp or a hunting camp, don't need to comply with the code. But as soon as they convert to, or if they're planned to be converted to, an automatic heating system, then those provisions of the code that aren't of the camp or that weren't built to the standards of RBES would need to be brought up. So typically that would be walls, insulation, ceiling, windows, etc. There's also a provision in RBES that addresses owner-builder projects. So this was specifically a provision that was put in with the addition when the code went into effect in the first place. Okay. So specifically, I'm sorry. So owner-builder projects, they're specifically exempted from meeting the technical requirements of the code, but the code is very specific, indicating that the owner of an owner-builder project to follow under this exemption, the owner must direct the details of construction, including the energy items that must live in the building. So it isn't somebody who hires a builder or a general contractor to do the work for them. They need to be specifically in that role of directing all the details of construction. They still must do the calculations, complete and file an owner-builder disclosure statement. So while they don't need to build an owner-builder project doesn't have to specifically be built to the provisions of the code, there needs to be, you need to figure out what needed to be done and make those disclosures as part of this statement that is included in the code documentation. And then the big catch here is that while it's okay to build a subcode home and live in it, if that's what the owner-builder prefers, the subsequent buyer must be made aware that that home is deficient. And so the owner-builder must disclose in writing to any potential buyers before a purchase and sales agreement what the deficiencies in that home are, so the buyer is aware that is a subcode home. Built into the code as well is provisions around liability. Since we don't have code enforcement officers and there's not a fines process throughout Vermont, the RBES does allow homeowners to take civil action against the builder or whoever the person is who certified the building. We're aware of a handful of times where this has taken place. And as part of that, damages that may be sought could include the increased energy costs due to the more inefficient building and the cost to bring the building into compliance, as well as court and attorney's fees. So while this doesn't happen regularly, it has happened, and it is the sort of stick that's being held over builders for not building to the code requirements. There is a 6-year statute of limitations as well. Okay, as part of the code, there actually are 2 parts of it. I mentioned this earlier, but the stretch code was written into the code more recently as a separate, more stringent code. So as of December 15th, all Act 250 projects must meet this more stringent stretch code. It's also available for towns to voluntarily adopt if they feel like they want to do more than just encourage the basic code. So there are at least a couple towns that have done this in Vermont in the past. I believe South Burlington has adopted it recently as well too, or has that under effect. There's a certificate I've mentioned a number of times, a one-pager that's available from the Energy Code Assistance Center or the Department of Public Service website. The copy of it is in the RBES handbook. This will be modified and updated with the new code. It's basically one pager that captures all the information in the building, and it needs to be posted somewhere in the building, filed with the town clerk's office, and also filed with the Department of Public Service. There's a handbook that accompanies the code, And in it, it basically takes a lot of the code language, which is sort of challenging to digest in many times, and boils it down and simplifies it to make it easier to for builders, designers, others to comply with the code. So this is available and will also be updated as part of the code, the new code update process. This is the 2015 version that's available right now, and there will be a 2019 version once the code is finalized. So I mentioned one of the provisions of the code is that there are a set of basic requirements. These are in place for 2015 and will be updated for 2019 as well too. So these include some, regardless of which compliance path you take, that would be either the prescriptive package path, the res check software, or the HERS rating software. Regardless of which of those three compliance paths, you still need to meet a number of basic requirements for every home. And that includes some air sealing and leakage, addressing vapor retarders, making sure that we don't get moisture in our building cavities, duct location, insulation, and sealing, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in terms of efficiency and balancing, equipment sizing as well. There's a programmable thermostat requirement in every home, fireplaces and solid fuel burning appliances, so wood stoves, pellet stoves, exhaust fans and other related appliances, ventilation, maximum window U factor, electric systems, mechanical system piping, insulation and circulating hot water systems, so hot water provisions, lighting, heat pump, supplementary heat, pools, hot tubs, spas, and certification. So there's detail behind each one of these that I have included in the subsequent slides here. I'm not going to read them all. These are available if you'd like more information. So each of those categories is here, and the requirements for the code for the 2019 version is listed in the slides, and these 3 slides in this slide deck. Those are all the existing provisions of the code and the basic requirements. In addition to those basic requirements, the new RBES handbook will also include some details and graphics to make sure that things are made clear. For instance, air sealing trouble spots, so pointing out all those areas that we have seen in our experience, and this is being borrowed from work the Department of Energy and other programs have put out there to help better address our building performance of our homes. But there's some handbook will have additional graphics and details as well to help you comply with the code. So with that, I'm going to stop this recording and start another one that will have the proposed 2019 RBES updates. And so look for that if you'd like to learn what more is coming.